At the end of the day, the job and goal of the reviewer should be to provide the audience a balance of subjectivity along with fact-driven objectivity. There was a sizable crowd that felt the original A90 was the best headphone amp you could buy at its time of release. The A90D pretty much kicked in the door with all kinds of hype, and maybe a lot of it's well-deserved. I mean, measurement-wise, it's unreal. But that's a trend that a lot of topping products follow, and I for one am a bit torn on it. They boast almost unheard of numbers, but from this point, are we just gonna judge a product completely on numbers alone? Or should we do what I prefer? Respect the measurements as advancements in technology, but also consider things like livability, real-world performance, and just plainly how the product makes you feel while you use it. First and foremost, this is a pretty good looking little amp-preamp combo. It's very sleek with minimal buttons and this screen. It's not an OLED screen that's loaded with information. Instead, it's really as simple as it could get. But I think it's perfect for this unit. My eye was instantly drawn to its subdued mix of digital and analog. I then pair it with an R2R volume relay that clicks through each change, providing perfect channel balance at any volume. Something about it must bring back a sort of nostalgia. I'm really not certain why this screen does it for me. Maybe it feels like an old alarm clock from my youth, or an old clock on your first CD player. It doesn't really matter, other than I really enjoy it. To complete the tour of the front of this amp, one thing that might jump out at you right away, if you're previously experienced with the original A90, someone stole all your toggles. It's true, we lost the analog feel and the simple toggles for selections between the preamp and the headphone amp, inputs and the gain settings, but fear not, we do still get to do everything we could before, but admittedly, it's going to take a little bit longer on the Discrete. They actually gave us a remote on this one, so you can do everything from power, volume, inputs, gain settings, saved user settings, even adjusting the volume curve. I personally think the remote is a great addition, but not so much from the standpoint of a headphone amp that is generally going to be at, an arm's reach anyways. Where the remote will excel is using this as a preamp to pair with speakers. It's really an improvement as far as upgrading its dual function abilities on this. And without the remote, I would have had a hard time justifying this as a desirable preamp. The other way you can make all your adjustments is through the multifunction volume knob on the unit itself. These can all be accomplished either through some clicks of the volume knob or a separate settings menu that is reached by holding the volume button in while powering it on with the switch behind it. The unit appears really simple, but there's actually a lot of options to go through. A quick overview of some of the options are brightness, simply 1 through 4. 4 gives you a mid brightness level and then actually turns the screen off after 30 seconds. Then you have the ability to turn your remote on or off. A trigger, which is quite uncommon on a headphone amp, but nice for the preamp side. This setting allows you to change it from a trigger in or a trigger out. And then next to that, we have the volume memory. You can select to memorize the volume for each input or output. And then a safe volume mode. It will automatically revert the volume to your selected safe level when you switch inputs. And then finally, the selection for what you want your safe volume to be. Do I wish it still had toggles? Yes, I do. It's just so quick and easy, but at the same time, removing the toggles brought me that screen and cleaned up the appearance a bit. So at the end of the day, I think it's a fair trade for me. They could have possibly stacked the single-ended connection above the balance, and then it would have given room for everything, but maybe I'm just being greedy. So what's the D at the end of the A90 all about? If you didn't know, it stands for discrete, as in this uses fully discrete components in the NFCA module. There are 4 discrete NFCA modules, each containing 39 transistors each. The 4 is important as it signifies that this is indeed a fully balanced input to output amplifier and preamp. The idea here is that matched transistors will improve the distortion and noise performance. I wish I had the original on hand so I could compare. It's an interesting one in that if you look at the spec sheet, it's really close in almost every category, slightly favoring the new A90D release, but at the same time, many who have had both units on hand claim it's really easy to hear the differences between these units. I can't argue it either way, only having the new unit, but it's interesting nonetheless. Possibly some of the sound characteristics are simply the synergy of the components inside, being this is discrete. We're dealing with a lot of additional components that could be influencing the sound in a positive manner. In all reality, a discrete amplifier should be noisier, more noise, crosstalk, things along those lines, but Topping did something actually interesting here as well. They encapsulated the modules, which is likely how they're able to keep all of the numbers in check. Taking a quick tour of the back, we have the USB for firmware updates, and then this EXT plug. This one comes into play primarily for those who want to use this as a preamp, It allows you to connect their EXT90, which expands your inputs and outputs over RCA and XLR. Beyond that, it's pretty simple. XLR and RCA inputs, as well as RCA and XLR outputs. Along the power connection, we have the trigger, which I previously mentioned, being able to switch from in or out, and the ground loop terminator. If you run into anything like a ground loop, you can select this to lift, and it should eliminate that issue. Let's talk about the power before we dive into my subjective thoughts on how these actually sound. At 16 ohms, these are pretty insane. It's just under 10 watts versus the previous generation, around 7.5 watts. Although there's a really large bump in power at 16 ohms, the playing field definitely evens out here. At the higher impedance numbers, both the first gen and the new Discrete are pretty much the same, delivering a single watt at 300 ohms. What this tells us is that they engineered this basically for flexibility. You can, basically drive any set of drivers with ease. Higher impedance will get that 1 watt, and really high wattage availability for something like a power-hungry set of planar headphones. While this isn't the most powerful headphone amp created, even bested in this category by topping themselves in the A90D Pro, it still really doesn't bring you any limitations as far as what hardware you can run through these. Now let's get into the sound on these. I'm not a reference headphone guy. I don't own 50 pairs or anything like that, or a pair of Susvara headphones costing as much as a first car. What I do own and daily drive at my desk is a pair of road-tested HD6XXs that you can hardly deny is your best bang for the buck and likely owned by many of my viewers. So all that being said, I feel like it's a great reference for an amp like this. I think I'll pick up a couple other reference point headphones in the near future to test some of the demanding options, as well as some IEMs, but today we're going to cover the sound of the A90D connected to a set of HD6XXs, an SMSL SU8S DAC, and a simple Weems streamer. As with most topping products, detail retrieval and transparency is going to be a point of focus. Their products always seem to bring out the most of a recording, good or bad. Everything I listened to had a very defined sound, nothing lacking across the range. I would peg this one as a mostly neutral sound, if anything, and ever so slight lean into the warm side. The mid-range and bass has a presence that slightly stands out a little bit more than the treble, a bit of a relaxed tone, which I prefer much over nails on the chalkboard boosted treble. To break it down a bit further, let's start with my thoughts on the bass. It's very clean, yet quite punchy in the mid-bass regions. I felt as if the bass lines and drums carried details rather than just a boom, almost like when you properly integrate a sub into a 2-channel system. It's not meant to overshadow, and really shouldn't even notice that it's there if it's blended all in correctly. But then again, you might be a bass head and you want it to stick out. In a 2-channel system, you could simply increase the gain on your sub to create more of a tactile response. But dealing with something like this, it's going to be a case of finding the right headphones to introduce some of the sonic changes in that way. The good thing here is the topping is going to provide the clean sound and power to really open you up to anything you want to do. So just research, find the drivers that'll fit your needs, and rest assured the A90D will deliver the bass. Now into the mid-range. It's not an overly or exaggerated warmth by any means, but I feel like they definitely tuned it in a way to give you a little bit of a taste. I feel like it's probably the most neutral sounding headphone amp that I've reviewed yet. The mid-range is likely the strongest sonic range between the lows, mids, and highs. And if anything, it certainly elevates the fun factor on listening. So I know I just said it's the most natural sounding, but the more I think about it, I'm not sure. I want to take that back and just say that it produces a lifelike sound that's a fun listen across several genres. The treble actually takes a back seat in comparison to the mids and lows. The intensity and sizzle is dialed back just a little bit, a couple notches or two. The transparency is still top notch and right in the range where I prefer it. But there is something about this strong mid-range and dialed back treble that can really bring out a strong and powerful performance in the vocals and instruments. So I would also classify this one as bad recording safe. Pull out those crappy recordings and let them be free. I keep these subjective opinions short for the most part. But at the same time, I want people to understand how to best use subjective reviews. These are my opinions and experiences. Yours may differ depending on several factors, such as your equipment pairings, preferences, or even your hearing. So what I would suggest people to do is to identify their listening traits, and then key in on certain things during a review. You should be able to identify if you like a forward sound, detailed and bright, or something a little more laid back on the warm side. Are you a bass head, or is soundstage going to be the top of your priority list? To give an example, we could take something like a pair of headphones and how comfortable they are. I could tell you I wore a particular set all day and its comfort on my ears was fantastic, better than anything I've ever had before. That's a highly subjective take. Would everyone find it as comfortable as my description? Of course not, and really there isn't any way of knowing. But to be completely objective, I would simply tell you what it was made of and its appearance. But I would argue that isn't enough information. The best thing a subjective review can provide is his or her particular observations along with the non-measurables, things like how a product makes you feel. At the end of the day, the job and goal of the reviewer should be to provide the audience a balance of subjectivity along with fact-driven objectivity. Then it's up to you, the audience, to determine how much of this actually applies to you. That's the hardline approach, but it's also completely fine to take in all reviews with a grain of salt and just view them for entertainment. Not everything has to be so serious. In conclusion, before I break down the pros and cons, I just want to say this is actually my favorite headphone amp that I've reviewed. I could definitely see myself using this as a daily driver for my headphones, as well as my preamp duties at my desk. It just does everything so well and has the flexibility that I don't feel like I'm really compromising in any particular area. It leaves me wide open to headphone pairings and does a great job with my particular music tastes. I could really see this end up being my reference piece. Now to quickly go over the pros and cons. I think it looks great on my desk, compact enough and has a solid build quality. And it's extremely powerful. Like I said, the book is wide open to whatever kind of gear you want to bring in and test. And it has the sound that I prefer. It's mostly neutral with a little edge in the mid-range. Noise and distortion are never going to be an issue here. Topping products tend to be number chasers, and this one is no exception. And this one also has a remote, and that greatly boosts the preamp functions on this, and is something that would have shown up on my cons list if it lacked one. I could also listen to this amp for hours without fatigue, and I think that might be the most important out of all of these. As for the cons, it's a small list, but nonetheless, I kind of like toggles, but I also like that screen on the 90D. Maybe it's not so much I like the toggles, it's just the fact I like how simple and fast it is to make the changes. That's all I really have for cons. Maybe if I wanted to really pick on it, I could say the volume knob doesn't really have a tactile feel. You sort of get it through the relay clicks, but it could use a little bit more resistance. There, are you happy? I came up with something else. As always, if you made it this far, I truly appreciate you. Please like and subscribe so I can continue to bring in new products and reviews. Take care. See ya.